Like, how creative do you get with things, or do you just try to do what the show is? And you try to emulate and elevate at the same time. You want to deliver the show, but also elevate it in these little ways that are coming from your own style or your own inspirations.
Hello and welcome to Off the Lot. The film industry is changing fast, and if you want to make movies, it's time to become your own gatekeeper. If you've got a vision and the drive to make it happen, this podcast is for you.
We're your hosts, Ken Kabatov and Anthony Epp, and every week we dive into the hustle, challenges, and real-world strategies of independent filmmaking. We talk to directors, producers, and industry pros about what it really takes to get your film made.
So if you're serious about making movies, hit follow or subscribe. It helps us keep this going. And if you like what you hear, spread the word, share the episode, leave a comment, and help more indie filmmakers find Off the Lot. Let's dive in. Today we're diving into the world of post-production with masterful editor Andrew Gust. Andrew's one of the creative forces in the editing bay behind series like The Morning Show on Apple TV Plus and Hallmark's The Chicken Sisters. Plus, he's edited so many indie features and short films that have resonated with audiences all around the world. He was also the editor of my latest short film, The Doukhobor, which is now on the festival circuit.
What we find incredible about editors like Andrew is how they're essentially the final storytellers, taking all these puzzle pieces from production and crafting them into something that moves us, thrills us, and keeps us watching. Andrew's going to take us behind the curtain today to see how the real magic happens after the cameras stop rolling. Welcome, Andrew Gust.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here. Thank you for that wonderful intro.
Oh, no, thank you. We really appreciate you being here. As we've mentioned, you're our first editor. So this is very exciting to talk about all things post-production and what goes into it, both from, the independent film side and also the big studio streamer side of things. So obviously, the big thing that you're working on right now is The Morning Show. You've been a part of that for 3 seasons, correct? Since the beginning?
Actually started on the second season, and then about 3 weeks in is when COVID hit. And so I pivoted away to an animated project at that point. So mostly I've been on for all of season 3 and season 4.
Yeah, that's great. And starting as an assistant editor and then working your way up to editor, correct?
Exactly. Yeah. Starting as an assistant under my wonderful mentor, Carol Kravitz-Ikanian. During season 3, kind of worked my way up to co-editing an episode with her. And then now on season 4, being a full editor.
This is one of the biggest shows in the world with some of the biggest stars in the world. And we'll dive into that in a little bit. But just to give some context, we're just curious, how did you get started exactly? What was your path to getting to this point? Because also, it's not the only thing you work on. You still do a lot of independent projects on the side. And so it's very interesting to hear about what was your path and how do you juggle all of this?
I grew up pretty far from the film industry in rural Manitoba. When I think back as a child, our TV had 2 channels that were, received from this tall old antenna that you can, I'm sure, remember, that were on top of the houses. So we had 2 channels growing up. We called that Farmer Vision. One was CBC and the other was CTV. So my exposure was actually pretty limited for a while. But I always remember Sunday nights was the wonderful world of Disney. And that's when they would play one Disney film. And so that was always just this highlight of my week. And that was sort of the initial spark into just being a movie fan. And then my exposure still was pretty limited for a long time, but to my dad's credit, he would always have a video camera around, just for documenting kind of family events and things that were happening on the farm and everything. So I think that was, I guess, my first kind of introduction into the actual nuts and bolts of filming things, and then later on learning how to cut those things together.
Did you cut together the home videos like Steven Spielberg did, in Fablemans?
It was pretty far from anything that elaborate, definitely. But eventually, yes, there was some August of 1998 super comps, harvest time at the Craigsford farm sort of thing. Those were the initial put togethers. But jumping way ahead from that, and kind of after high school going to film school in Vancouver, that is sort of was my first major exposure to how it all worked. And then a couple years after that, working at the film school as a teacher's assistant, where I met Scott Watson, who was a professor at the time. And I worked with him for about a year. And then he decided to go back to his old job that was at a place at the time called Keystone Entertainment. And he brought me on to my first kind of real film, which was the illustrious Santa Paws 2, The Santa Pups, which I'm sure everyone is very familiar with.
Everyone's seen that. It's a classic.
Classically classic Yeah, yeah.
Exactly. So that was, I think, maybe the 10th sequel slash spin-off of the illustrious Airbud franchise, which I think people in Vancouver all know that that's
Yes.
like a Vancouver, Canada success story. But people outside of Vancouver don't realize that that movie was like fully produced in Vancouver. And then I think after was acquired by Bona Vista and became a Disney property. So yeah, it's kind of
Oh,
a
okay.
cool success story for BC and Canada.
Put animal films on the map in Canada. That's
Yeah, that franchise was an institution here. I mean,
yeah.
so many films, right?
And it's still going. So that's, I mean, that's where I kind of cut my teeth under the main editor at the time, Kelly Herron, who's still working in Vancouver as an editor, really talented guy. You know, that's really where I learned the nuts and bolts of, you know, a real film. And that place too, Keystone Entertainment, it was called at the time, was such a cool training ground for young editors and just like post production people, because they had this building where they had everything under one roof. You know, we cut the films there. They had a sound mix stage, an ADR booth, like a Foley room, up to like 30, 40 visual effects artists working on these films to make the dogs talk and to recreate, you know, South Pole with reindeer and everything like that. And it all happened under one roof. And so that was really my base, my starting point to like see everything in the post production process, not just editing, but like the sound design, the sound mix, the visual effects, color happened there too. Like everything was under that one roof. So that was kind of where it all started. And
That's great because usually it's just so like, disjointed or,
totally, I think it's really rare. There's only a few other places I think that have all those things under one roof. So that was just like, it blew my mind, and it was such a good exposure to the whole post-production process. So I worked for them for several years, and while doing, you know, indie features on the side with people in Vancouver and stuff like that. And then eventually made them move down here, and kind of the rest is history.
did you know that as an editor to be, successful that I'd likely have to go down to LA? Was that a thing or, what was your decision making process there?
I think even in film school, there was, you know, the professors would sort of allude to that a little bit, that there was maybe a like a bit of a ceiling in Vancouver at the time, at least. And I was really lucky to have dual citizenship. My mom was born and raised in South Dakota, so I already had dual citizenship. So it made it really easy to move to LA and kind of, you know, get started here. And
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, I think it became maybe more apparent the longer I worked in Vancouver that there's just more work in LA. But it's, you know, now that times are changing and everyone wants editors in Vancouver and Toronto. So
Well, it's for the tax credits, right?
exactly.
The tax credits in Ontario, Quebec, and BC are so lucrative for post production.
Exactly. Exactly. So, I mean, I think, you know, it's still obviously the majority of development and post is happening here, but things are changing. Who knows? Maybe I'll be up in Vancouver before I know it. And the next gig that I'm on, you know, the Chicken Sisters, that's all done in Vancouver. That's part of the reason that I'm working on that one, is because I am able to, you know, get a bit of a tax break. I think at least the federal one, working on that as an editor. So a lot of work is coming back up, at least at the moment, to Canada.
What made you decide editing was kind of the path you wanted to take? Because obviously, film school exposes you to all the fields, if you will, and editing is kind of a very. It's often actually I found at Vancouver Film School, it's almost like a very niche place to target yourself.
No, you're right. I think, you know, if I were to kind of count the hours spent on different crafts at film school, editing was one of the kind of lesser emphasized things. But yeah, what I really love about it is that you have this entire wonderful crew of creatives out there grinding, getting you this amazing footage, and then it all comes to you as the editor. And it's such a privilege to be able to take all of that hard work and put it all together. And what I really love about it is that just the smallest change in how you put the film together and where you cut and where you put things next to each other has such a big impact on the whole story. And so I really kind of just love that idea that just even a few frames this way or that way can shape the story in a totally different way. And it just feels really satisfying to be able to kind of craft the story at the end there and have be part of the third rewrite, as they say. I'm sure you guys have heard that quote that a movie's written or made three times, once in the script, once when you shoot it, and then once in the editing room. Yeah, it's just that's what I really love is working closely and intimately with a few people. I've worked on set, and it's kind of being on set is a bit of an editor's nightmare, because there's so much chaos and things are happening so quickly and kind of spontaneously, it seems, at least at times. Whereas in the editing room, you get to just kind of really hone in and have those really intimate kind of talks with the director or the showrunner about where you're trying to go creatively. And that to me is just the most enjoyable part for me.
When you're on set, right? And we are rewriting the story on set in a way, and we're working with the actors, and but it's just chaos, right? You're dealing with camera issues, or like we're running into a meal penalty, and who's going to pack up the trucks, and or like where are the trucks going overnight, and like all of this crazy logistical stuff. But you have to remember that like we're here to tell a story, and sometimes that gets lost on set. Even as a director, you have a million things on your mind, but working in the editing room with an editor, and it's just like, okay, this is the material, this is all we have, so how do we make this work? And I loved what you said, just going back to that one little change can have such a profound effect on the story, and you're really just playing with people's like psychology in a way, right? Like and like how we process moving pictures and sound, and you're really manipulating our brains in such an interesting way where you don't really get that with a script. People skim a script and whatever, and then on set you really put it together in an interesting way. But in the editing room, that's really where the magic happens, right? To be able to create these moments.
Yeah, and you get to there's sort of more room for error too, or trial and error and experimentation, right? I mean, on set, obviously you're experimenting and doing multiple takes and trying different things, but the time is limited and the stakes are high, right? And not to say there isn't sort of crunchy deadlines in post where you have to get things out at a certain time, but there's this freedom of experimenting and trying things that are crazy and shouldn't work, but what the hell, let's try it anyways and see if it inspires any sort of idea, or try this song, this needle drop that seems totally wacky for this moment. But you have the freedom to do stuff and then very quickly undo it if it's not working. I mean, that's the beauty of nonlinear modern editing is you can do many different versions, try anything, and just kind of let it inspire you. You don't have to worry about it being perfect like right away. It's a process, and progress, especially in the editing room, is not necessarily linear, right? You can try a million versions, and go a bunch of different ways, and just experiment and find what really resonates for the story.
And what do you find is the biggest difference then between independent film and like a feature that you've edited versus something like The Morning Show, which is on a TV schedule, albeit it's a streamer, so there's more time, right, for post production. It's not like you're making network
Yeah.
TV where it's like this episode airs next Tuesday, right? We have to get this out. What to you is the biggest difference there besides the time crunch as far as workflow?
If I were to compare, indie stuff almost is a little more similar to something that has a bigger budget and a little looser deadline in terms of having the freedom to experiment and having a little more time to try stuff without a looming, air date next week sort of thing. But either way, maybe a more drastic comparison is between something like The Morning Show and this series, The Chicken Sisters, that I'm doing. Like, I've cut two episodes on the morning show this season, and I started start of last July, and I'm ending like next week. So I don't how many months is that, like 9, 10 months for two episodes versus
Wow.
when I
Yeah.
Wow.
when I'm on the Chicken Sisters, it's the same like start to finish in like 3 months, and that will not change because they have their air dates and they have
Yeah.
their budget, and those things are rock solid. Whereas when you're working for a series for someone like Apple, there's a little more flexibility just in terms of sliding deadlines a little bit, and the budget always plays into that in a big way, of course.
Because the morning show is effectively like it's a streaming show, so it basically could be editing multiple episodes that are shot at very different times of like a scene from episode 1 could be shot near the end of the schedule kind of thing.
I think all of Apple's stuff is usually one a week. but yeah, basically. And by the way, I really do like. I feel like it's becoming more popular now again to space out the releases one a week, versus the
Right.
Netflix kind of all at one drop, because I feel like that just benefits a show and its following in so many great ways, because you get that the water cooler talk thing just
Yes.
doesn't happen when you
Yes.
drop it all at
Yes,
once,
I agree.
and so I love that more platforms are doing the one a week thing. I think Apple does it for everything. I think HBO does it for most stuff as well. And I think it's just way better model to do it that way, because you get to talk about each episode on that Monday morning with your coworkers, and you look forward to the next one, the anticipation, when it drops all at once, you don't get to, it's just like,
It keeps it in the zeitgeist. It keeps people talking about it, and
yeah,
don't get me started about like again, Netflix has ruined everything in my opinion. So and now we're course correcting, right? And even at the end of all of these strikes,
yeah,
we're now going back to basically advertising video on demand, weekly
yeah,
schedule. We're just going back to cable TV on your phone.
There was a novelty factor to the idea of binge watching and, it all dropping on a Friday night, and then you binge watch the
yeah,
entire weekend, and I think that was made even bigger by, for example, COVID, where you needed to, like, have 24 hours of entertainment, and you needed to, like, go through an entire story in, like, a week or something like that. But you're right, I feel like they've made that correction, and it's made it more interesting and more compelling, and it's actually more profitable, I think, probably in the long run. If it's gonna be drawn out over 3 months to watch the whole show, you've gotta either subscribe at the beginning or you have to wait till everything's released and then watch it all at once, and people don't wanna be last, right? There's that whole fear of missing out.
it's like, oh yeah, there was a reason that we had commercials. They paid the bills,
Yeah,
like
yeah, they
we're
were.
Yeah.
seeing the revenue dry up for these certain things. And I'm like, okay, you know what? I'll watch a few commercials if it means that more shows get to be made because of that. Like, it's not so bad. I mean, if you're watching a feature, I don't want to have a commercial break in the middle, but I'll watch some at the start of the film if that's going to make this film possible. Absolutely.
The other thing that hasn't been course corrected yet is the residual side of things, because that's what made cable TV work, right? Is everyone along the chain got the rewards of the success of the show. And so from, actors getting residuals to writers to directors, and like, look, this is a freelance job. And so in the dry spells, those residual checks helped keep people alive. And that's gone. And so now with shorter orders though, like 10 episode orders, 8, 6 episodes sometimes, and very little to no residuals because of how the streaming model works. And I know Netflix has changed a few things, but you have to basically be like Adolescence or the number one show on Netflix to actually get, a royalty check from them. That still hasn't been fixed. And I'm hoping that that can be corrected in negotiations over the next few years. But at least we're going back to a model for consuming television that makes sense as a viewer and keeps people
Yeah.
talking about your show.
Totally, totally agree. And Anthony, to go back to your original question about, is the process different when you're working on a streaming show that doesn't necessarily kind of drop all at once or have the episodes releasing really quickly after they're locked? It is different, and it does have a lot of benefits in terms of being able to, like I said, even though Apple releases one a week, pretty much all 10 episodes are pretty close to being completely done by the time that starts to happen. And so most of these shows, I think, get shot in blocks now, or at least a lot of them. That's what I've been seeing a lot lately, where there's like block one is the first 2 episodes, and so on and so forth. But also, especially on a show like the morning show where it has this huge ensemble cast, there's a lot of factors that come into play about availability and when who's available for what episode and for how long and everything like that. So they shoot in blocks, sort of, but then there are always some scenes that, in block one, you might need to grab some scenes from episode 9 and 10 because that's the only time that actor was available, or that's the only time that location was available. The morning
Yeah.
show, for instance, does like 95% of their shooting in LA on stages and locations as well. But then they do usually like 2 weeks or something like that in New York, because in the show it's set in New
Mm-hmm.
York. So they'll do some iconic New York exteriors or some iconic New York kind of like interiors, like there's a new kind of famous skyscraper. I forget what it's called, but it's like all window and mirrors kind of thing looking out towards New York City. So they'll do about 2 weeks of that just to be like, yes, remember it's set in New York, it's incredible how well that works, like one
Yeah,
good establishing shot, one good location that is like undeniably in Manhattan, like just makes you believe for the rest of the series.
we did that for a Christmas episode that was set in San Francisco, where we shot we shot the entire movie up here, and then we flew down with us with a small crew to San Francisco, and we were like, okay, we need some Golden Gate Bridge shots, and we need some just a couple of tiny little bits to like that will anchor everybody in that idea that we're in San Francisco, and then you just look and you're like, oh yeah, the whole movie was clearly filmed in San Francisco, and then when people say
Yeah.
it was filmed in Vancouver, they're like, well, no, how did you get the gold? Did you shoot that at Lionsgate Bridge and just doctor it or something? And we're like, no, that's the part we went south. Like you said, you just need a little taste of a reminder that
A little goes a long way for sure.
yeah,
And I mean, as Vancouverites, so well that Vancouver, there's that good video someone made, Vancouver Plays Itself or whatever it was called. It was
never
showing
plays
how
itself. Yeah,
versatile, never plays
Yeah.
itself. Yeah.
yeah.
How versatile Vancouver is for playing other cities. You shoot so much inside of Vancouver, and then one shot of the Golden Gate Bridge, and you believe you're in San Fran. Yeah,
There's that famous. I don't know if you ever saw that Rubble in the Bronx, that Jackie Chan movie
Oh yeah.
came out, where it was shot, entirely in Vancouver, and there's almost nothing New York about it. I mean, it's called Rumble in the
right.
Bronx. If you looked at any of the location, there's the BC Place in the background, and they're on a
Yeah,
hovercraft through a hovercraft that comes up on the beach by the city, and I'm like, where in New York does this exist at
Well,
all?
and just like the straight up like North Shore mountains, right? Like, and it
Yeah,
was it
yeah,
was what like in the
like,
'90s they couldn't visual effect them out, right?
yeah.
And it's just like, well,
yeah.
where are those mountains? Like, I don't know, New Jersey, but like that's New Jersey doesn't have those
There's no
those
there's no
mountains.
mountains there.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, people want to believe, right? And so
So when you get the footage for the morning show, here's what I think is a really cool part about your job right now is that you sit down for work and you open up the computer, the Avid, and you get to just start cutting footage. And you're not just cutting like indie filmmaker, actor, short film actor. You have Jennifer Aniston, Reese Witherspoon, John Hamm, Billy Crudup on your screen, and you're going like, I'm playing with their performances right now. That's so neat. What, like, I mean, to me, I know the answer is cool, but like, what's it like?
yeah, no, it's crazy. It's crazy. I have to pinch myself every day during dailies because it's just you have these like international movie stars on your screen, and you have to at some point just kind of like forget that and just see them as the character and just go off of that and forget that they're Jennifer Aniston. I mean, you're never gonna totally forget
Who
that's
can
Jennifer
forget?
Aniston, and also Greta Lee, who's just
Oh, yeah,
incredible.
love Greta Lee.
And this season also is going to be Boyd Holbrook. And like when I think about how many stars are in the show, it's incredible that they're able to write a script around that many people, because you have so many incredible actors and you have to give them each their own storyline. And I mean at times I think it is hard in the show, but they for the most part manage to interweave their stories in a way that feels like it's all connected. But yeah, I mean it is a very different sort of initial process compared to indie feature or something where it's a relatively unknown actor.
And is working with directors different on your show than, say, working with a director on an indie feature, or is the process generally the same?
Well, it's interesting with the morning show because, for instance, the two episodes I cut on this season, one of them was with Mimi Leader, who is also an EP on the show, and I mean she's legendary, as you know, directed Deep Impact, Pay It Forward. She was my favorite fact about her is that she was the first female graduate of AFI, like the first one. Like it
Wow.
just goes to show
Wow.
how long she's been doing this and how incredible she is. And then the other episode I cut was with Miguel Arteta, who is much more like comes from more of an indie background and kind of does much different, not deep impact type movies. He was there as a director and he did his pass and then he, moves on to a different show or a different feature. And so those two processes are very different because obviously Mimi does her director's cut and then she sticks around for the rest of the cuts too, for the producer's cut, for the partner's cut, which is Jen and Reese, having their notes because they're producers too. And then eventually the network cut. And so on episodes with Mimi, it's much more like a feature sort of mentality because she's there from day one to the very last moment
Right.
of the sound mix, So that's really nice because I think, in film school and everything coming up, like you get sort of taught more like the feature style of working with creatives, and the director is king, and you stay with them until the very end. Whereas when you find out about how TV works, you're like, oh, the director is there for like a week after they shoot, and then they're just gone, and you're like, what? This is crazy. I remember the first time working on a series having the director's cut. They just sent like one page of notes, didn't even come into the cutting room, and that was it. And I was like, what? That is insane. Like,
Oh,
how
wow.
does that work? But TV obviously is a writer's medium, and the showrunner is often that consistent voice throughout the process, and they just have to keep a really good handle on everything, on the story, on the tone, on the style, of everything all the way through. And so on an episode that's not Mimi's, we do like did Miguel's cut, and it was awesome working with him. And then now, actually, because of the recent negotiations, the producers give a bit of feedback, and then the director gets to do like 2 more days of stuff to address their initial notes, and then it switches over into producer's cut. So as the editor on a series, you keep what the director has done and what they're going for and remember their vision, but then you have to be able to also pivot and start molding it to the showrunner's vision. And ideally those are, cohesive, kind of similar thoughts. And sometimes they are, and sometimes they're not.
Because in pre-production, you would have a tone meeting or a page turn, so
Absolutely.
hopefully the showrunner and the director are on the same page, and there's often a writer or a
Absolutely.
producer on set with them. But yeah, sometimes I've been there where a director has like gone rogue and done a bunch of stuff that the producer's like, well, why do we have this crane shot that we're spending so much time on? Like, I'm just gonna cut out of it because it's not adding anything to the story. We're just gonna use the tail end where we see the actors. And TV
Yeah.
is different than a feature, right?
And your showrunner is also keeping in mind the entire season and the entire story arc of everybody, right? At the same time, whatever this episode is that you're editing at that moment is not the full breadth of the story that's being told. So you're trying to unify the elements and make it
Yeah.
cohesive so that episode 3 melds into episode 4 into episode 5 in the right way. You've got to hold back some things and show some things and do some tonal shifting to
Yep.
make sure that it's setting up for whatever the main climax of the season is going to be.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, in the same way that like on a feature, what might make for the best individual scene could be a little different than what's best for the movie as a whole, right?
Right.
And we all know that sometimes it's super painful to, kill your babies, as they say, and get rid of something from a scene that is just like on its own so amazing and is working so well and so beautiful. But when you zoom out, it's getting in the way, right? It might be slowing something down, where it's just you take it out so that you streamline and have a more focused vision throughout the whole thing. And in the same way, on a series, sometimes what you feel like, this I really want to have this in the episode, but then yeah, the showrunner or the you try to do it yourself, zoom out and think like, okay, but for the good of the season, actually we should probably remove this or change it in this way or move it around. And as an editor on the series too, when you're working with the director and switching to working with the producers, there's a big responsibility because you're probably, the person with the most intimate knowledge of every frame of dailies of that episode, because the showrunner may have been on set for a lot of it, but maybe not. A lot of the time they're in the writer's room frantically trying to finish
Yeah.
the remaining episodes. So there's a real responsibility on you as the editor, because you're the one who's there from day one of the dailies to the very end, and you know every frame, and you have to know when to sort of offer different ideas and sort of quickly relay what's available to make these changes that they want to do, because the showrunner just is not going to have time to sit down and watch every take and go through the whole thing take by take and scene by scene. So you really have to be able to respond to their direction really quickly and kind of show them what you have in order to achieve their goals.
When you're making your assembly and you're watching the dailies, how do you approach your assembly in terms of creative choices? Because Like, are you just cutting it together like per the script, like just the facts, ma'am? Or are you injecting, well, I've been on the show, for so long. I know, I feel like I know what the showrunner is going to want here. And then that assembly goes to the director, who then says, no, 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 this is not what my intention was. This is how it should be. And then, are you swinging back and forth between wild visions, providing that the director and the showrunner aren't on the same page? Or is your assembly, is it quite creative, or is it just,
Really varies a lot depending on how long you've been on the show, what your relationship is with the showrunner. Like you said, knowing what they like and what they want and what they will respond to. But all that said, even when it's someone that I've worked with multiple times, my first cut, I definitely leave everything in. I'm pretty careful not to cut out too much unless I think it's really, obviously something that can be trimmed down, and they're not going to miss it. But it's much easier to start with everything and then pare down from there. It's much easier to discuss taking something out, trimming something, tightening something than it is to discuss putting something back in and then rewatching it with that in.
Mhm.
It just adds sort of an extra step that probably is not the most efficient way to do it. I heard someone say one time that going back to directing on a series, you know, and you could easily ask that same kind of question to the director, right? Like, how creative do you get with things, or do you just try to do what the show is? And they said, like, you try to emulate and elevate at the same time. So you want to deliver the show, but also elevate it in these little ways that are coming from your own style or your own inspiration. So I'll take some liberties, and put in, they might have scripted a scene a certain way, and you wouldn't think that it calls for a needle drop there or like a little montage or anything like that. But if you're feeling inspired and it seems like the right choice for it, then you might try that. Yeah, it really depends on your relationship and knowing the taste of your showrunner. So you're always trying to, yeah, add your own little style, but not inject too much of your stuff. You always got to stay true to the show, right? You never want it to one episode partway through the series and go like, oh, this feels like a different show. You always
Right.
want it to stay really consistent and cohesive in terms of style. And that's, again, that's partly the responsibility of the showrunner, but also the editor, because like this season it's only 10 episodes, but we have four editors, that have very different backgrounds and credits. And so when it comes down to something like that, like you're trying to sort of discuss it with the other editors that are there, but at the end of the day, the showrunner has to kind of keep their finger on having things feel really consistent, cohesive style throughout the show.
Maybe switching over to independent film and like working kind of in the world that we are inhabiting, and maybe with, I know you and Ken worked on the Duca board together, right? What's your ideal workflow in that regard? Like, I mean, let's assume that you and the director haven't necessarily worked together before. Maybe you've worked together once or twice, but obviously this is a whole new project, whole new vision. What how do you like to work with the director? How do you like to work with that kind of a project?
That film was really special to me, working with both Ken and Chris on that, because I know them really kind of just a friendship level, but I hadn't worked that much with them on a professional level.
Yeah, it was our
And
first time
especially
working as director editor
with Ken, it was the
together.
first time. And so for something like that, to Ken's credit, he had done a lot of pre-production sort of development in terms of what kind of style and mood and tone. I mean, you had to pitch it to the DGC, so you had all these things very concretely kind of laid out your vision for it. And so that is a dream for an editor, because right away you really get a sense of where the director is trying to go with the film, what inspires them, what resonates with them from other films. And that really makes putting together the first cut a lot easier, because with a short film it can be really tough, because you're creating something totally from scratch. So it's a whole new film, it's a whole new sense of style and tone and everything that you're finding partly as you put it together, right? And short films are so great in that way, in terms of training for features, because it's really just a mini movie, and the whole process is the same, but on a much compressed scale. You still have to refine the tone of the film and figure out what rhythm and score and if there's going to be needle drops and stuff like that, what the DNA of that film is. Working with Ken and most directors, I think we talked a little bit during production about how Ken was feeling about different things as they shot them, but then after that, I think it's really nice to give the director just a bit of a breather after they're done shooting, and for the editor to do a relatively tight rough cut and then just send it all at once and kind of have the director respond fresh to those things. So that's sort of my process. Is usually, if the director wants to see scenes as we go, like I'll send them scenes and everything. But I think there's definitely value in also giving the director just a bit of a breather, kind of refresh in
Yeah.
between shooting and seeing that first cut. I don't know. Did that seem valuable to you, Ken, to kind of just like have just a step away before seeing an assembly of it?
It did because, we had our like pre-production tone meeting with Chris and with Cole, our producer, and with you to just walk through the script and like, okay, this is what we're going for. And one of our key touchstones for the movie was the witch. So, because the Doukhobor is sort of a folk horror allegory, and so that was good to have. And then during production, I think we touched base a little bit about just certain things that were going on, or like maybe we're changing this, but we didn't really talk too much. It was just too crazy also, like on my part. It was an intense 4-day shoot. And again, it was only 4 days. It wasn't, a month or whatever. But right after we finished, I mean, we had a great assistant editor on board as well, Roberto Borges, who was there every day collecting the dailies and putting everything together for you, or organizing all of the footage for you so that you could just dive right in as soon as we were done. I will say I was blown away by how quickly and how well put together the first like rough cut was. Because I think you did it again, it's a short film. You did it in about a week. I was kind of expecting it to be like 2 weeks or whatever. But not only did it come in, and even that week just gave me a breather because I had been living with this thing for 6 months, maybe more actually at that point. But to not think about it and then watch a rough cut that came in, but you had some great like temp sound design in there. The temp music that you chose, it was so tight. It was too long, obviously. It always is, but it was just like, whoa, this is a movie. It was such an amazing experience, and I watched it with my girlfriend Kareen, and I always say that she's gonna hate it, but like we've been together for so long, and in that time, Kareen has only cried during 2 movies. One was Past Lives, which is brilliant, and the other one was the first rough cut of the Doukhobor. And like we're both in tears by the end of this movie, and it's 16 minutes, and you brought us to tears, and it was like, okay, I think we have something here. And it was just so fun to just dive in at that point and tweak some things. And I'd love for you to talk about, because we were running a little bit long and the DGC runtime, I believe, was 16 minutes max with credits. Look, as a short film, you don't really want to be too much longer than that because you're going to have a tough time being programmed at a film festival, right? The sweet spot is kind of like 7 to 10 minutes for a longer film, like under 15. But we just tried so many ways to get this thing down, but it's a horror movie and it needs that time to breathe and to build suspense. But we cut out one major scene, like between her and her father in the living room. And that was a big part of the pitch, because there was like, and the way I directed that, there was like imagery between the father's hand and the monster's hand, and in the climax of the movie. And it was, this whole kind of story was centered around those two moments mirroring each other. But we ended up cutting it out, and like, talk about slaughtering your babies, right? That was a big moment of like, whoa, did we just lose the movie, or did it evolve into something greater? And I believe it evolved into something greater. But even with that cut, we still didn't have the time that we needed. And so then there was this moment where there was a scene in the middle where we're like, well, this is the one scene that's not actually like really driving the story forward. If you remember, it was the kitchen scene where, she's kneading the flour. And it was like, this is the one thing we can maybe afford to lose. But there was a beautiful character moment in it. And what did you think about that whole process? Because we tested it multiple different ways, right?
To respond quickly about the first cut that I
Yeah.
sent you, like I think it's so important these days. There's kind of no such thing as a rough cut anymore, at least in my mind. Like it shouldn't actually be rough and hard to watch. Like with what we have available today, like it's so easy to put some great score, some sound effects, even like tweak the color a little bit if you need to. Those things are so quick and easy. I mean, relatively, that there's kind of no reason not to do a little bit of that before it gets to the director. And it's one thing for first time relationships that I think is really important because it's kind of your first, like,
Yeah.
you're still kind of auditioning a little bit for the director, and that's like kind of the first test in a way, a little bit. And you also just want your director to have this sense of relief that, like, if this is the first cut, where we go from here is only going to be better. And then they can just focus in on being creative instead of being worried about, like, oh, that sounded a bit rough there, is that going to be okay? So I think it's really important these days to get a relatively polished first cut to your director. But yeah, moving on from that and to your point of discussing taking scenes out, especially for runtime. I mean, it's really hard, right? And you'll remember that I didn't pitch that right away as well. I don't think. Like I gave you the first cut. I think pretty much I left everything in,
Yeah.
and then I let you live with that and see it, and then let everyone live with that for a little bit. And then gradually start to discuss, okay, where could we tighten this up? What's maybe a bit of a double beat, or maybe this moment might be reading a little differently than had been intended in the script, or it could be misconstrued as something that might not actually benefit the story. Like, let's discuss, and you always want to bring it up just as a question, as a discussion. You never, as an editor, it's not your film. You never want to come in and be like, I took out this scene because it doesn't work here, and we got to cut that. Like, no, it's always a discussion. It's always a question. It's always a back and forth, a real, like, collaboration. And because you have to come to this decision together with the director, whether or not something might be beneficial to make a big change. And yeah, I think those are some things that, for as an editor, I just had a bit of the advantage of having a little more distance. I wasn't there. I mean, I had read the scripts beforehand, obviously, a couple times, but I hadn't gone through that whole process, and I wasn't there on set. And so it's just, that's the real advantage that the editor has, is fresh eyes, seeing this stuff for the first time and remembering your first impressions. It's so important to hold on to your first impressions because you only get that once. And yet most people who watch the movie, that's all they're going to walk away with, is the first impression. I mean, maybe they'll end up watching it a couple of times, but like, you really have to be careful to, as an editor especially, to hold on to that first impression that you have of something when you see it in the dailies or when you cut it together, because you can so easily lose that as you work on the film over and over and rework the scenes. You get used to things, and if you don't intentionally remember your first impression of how that felt when you saw it, it's a bit dangerous, because you really want to put yourself in the mindset of the viewer who's going to see it for the first time and maybe only once. And so it's really
Yeah.
important to get it right. So yeah, those scenes, they were beautiful moments, right? Especially like in the kitchen there. And that's, again, going back to the idea of, like, well, this is a great, how could we cut this? This is such a great moment. But zooming back out, just feeling like, okay, well, for the good of the film and the overall, like, flow from start to finish, it's actually maybe going to be a little more streamlined, a little more focused, a little more impactful in these other moments if we just get there a little quickly, or if we, reduce the number of ideas that we're trying to introduce there. But it's hard, right, for an editor too. Sometimes on the flip side, as an editor, you come up with, like I was talking about before, like a new little montage or something fun, and you find a kick-ass song that you're like, this is the best thing ever. And then, at the end of the day, it's like, well, yeah, but it's not really needed here. We got to keep the story moving,
It
and
doesn't
it's so
advance it.
hard to
Yeah.
lose those things. And that's why I'm a huge fan of getting feedback on films and test screening, because it gives you that whole new group of first impressions. And like if someone tells you how to try to fix something, it's usually never right. But like the note is usually there's
The
something
note
there,
behind the
you
note,
know.
there's something there that they're latching on to, that they're feeling. They can't describe exactly how they're feeling or why they're feeling it, but they're feeling something there. So you should probably address it somehow.
It might be the scene before or after that needs to be changed. Not
Yeah,
even like that's where they felt it in the scene in the middle, but maybe it was because the setup in the scene before wasn't quite, working for them.
totally.
So you really have to take that note and be like, okay, what is the note behind the note? What are they feeling here, and how can we fix that in the best way possible? But
Yeah.
that's my favorite part is just having those discussions with the director and going back and forth and talking about like what is this moment doing, what is it giving us, and or what is it potentially taking away. And again, the beauty of nonlinear editing is like, well, let's just try it, right? Let's try it and
Yeah,
watch it again and see how we feel, and or test it on other people and see how they feel about it now. And I think it's really important also. It's really hard on indie stuff as well, indie and bigger stuff, to not just show it to people who already know about the project. But I always try and show short films and projects I'm working on to people who know nothing about it, because that
Yeah.
is going to be the majority of people watching it, right? And
yeah,
sometimes it's hard to find find someone in your sphere who knows nothing about it, but I think it's really important. And that's one thing that I think features do really well, and series almost do none of, like test screening on people that haven't seen it. And I think they should, but I know there's just not always time. But
yeah.
big fan of test screening, even if some of the, you might get 90% of the notes are kind of meh, whatever. But then there's 10% or just one note that you're like, whoa, light bulb moment. This really changes everything.
I always think of notes as like if I cough or if I sneeze and in a room, there's 10 people there with a different diagnosis of what the problem is, right? Like why am I coughing? Why am I sneezing? And they all have their own interpretation as to why I just did that, right? But one of them could be right, but they can't all be right. But they all did identify that there is a problem because I did cough and I did sneeze. So that's where like the problem is there. The problem is the symptom, but the cause is something that's very much within. You need to go back and go, okay, well, let's do more. Let's figure out what the common linear problem is with this particular moment that is bumping people. And a lot of times it comes down to, well, we haven't set up the character properly to give that moment, to make that moment work or something, which like you said is 3 or 4 scenes back. And oftentimes when you get notes from people who watching it for the first time, especially if you prejudice with the idea of saying we're going to ask you for your feedback, well, everybody also feels like they have to have feedback, right? So sometimes you
Yeah,
get
yeah,
that
yeah.
you get that that's it's like, well, I should say something, and if I don't say something, then
Totally.
maybe I'm not smart enough or whatever it is. I didn't see the film for what it was supposed to be. So because everybody else seems
Yeah,
to be
yeah.
vigorously writing notes, and my note is,
Hmm.
the coloring looked weird here. That's it, and that maybe that doesn't feel intelligent. And so yeah, like you have to kind of sift through it all.
Totally. And you have to know your test audience too, right? Like most of the time when you're showing it to someone, their experiences, where they're coming from. And so you're able to kind of go through their notes with a grain of salt, knowing the history that they have with, their experiences in life. A note from one person may mean, even if it's the same note coming from this person versus this person, could mean totally different things a little bit. And that's why, when I show people, I usually just tell them, I'm gonna send you a cut of this film. Just watch it. If thoughts pop up, sure, write them down, whatever. But like, don't feel pressure to like write me back a page of notes. Just watch it as a viewer. If things really jump out, stick out to you, like hold on to those thoughts. But I'm just gonna call you afterwards and have a conversation. For that very reason of like, I don't want them to feel pressured to have notes just to have notes. Like some of the people I show the film to, they don't work in the film industry or anything like that. And I call them afterwards. I'm just like, did you like it? Was there anything that
Yeah.
kind of felt weird, whatever? And they're like, no, it's good. I liked it. And then I'll ask them some specific questions, but I'm not going to force them to like come up with issues, because then again, like you said, it might just be they're trying to think of things to tell you when really they just might have enjoyed the film and it works for them, you know?
Well, look, Andrew, as we wrap up here, we usually ask our guests if they have one piece of advice for anybody just starting out in the industry, and in this case, any up and coming editors that are thinking about going down this path. What's something that you could share with them? Some advice.
Yeah, absolutely. I think for up and coming editors, as well as really any like creative department head, I think it's important to have the mindset of being like a filmmaker first, editor second, or filmmaker first, whatever, costume designer second sort of thing. Because really, when you're working with directors and showrunners, they want to feel like you're approaching the project sort of from a holistic standpoint, not just your craft, you're not just thinking about the way the scenes are cutting together. You're thinking about the story as a whole. Really, that's what everyone wants, is like a partner in the storytelling process, right? Obviously, you need to know the technical nuts and bolts of it too, but that's overall sort of easy. I mean, you can learn that pretty quickly, and you will learn that just by doing it. But I think you have to be maybe a little more intentional about having like a filmmaker mindset and being able to communicate with people on that level to really get to the best final result.
Love that.
I think
That's great.
that's a great answer. I haven't heard
Yeah.
it put that way before, where it's like you want filmmaker first and then specific craft second. I love that.
Yeah, that's so true. We're all storytellers, we're all filmmakers. Yeah, specializing in certain crafts. I love it. Yeah. Well, Andrew, my friend, Gusto, thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Geez, that flew by. That was so fun. Thanks for having me, guys.
Thank you so much for everything, and for just wish you good luck on the morning show.
Okay, so that's it for this week's episode of Off the Lot. We want to hear from you. If there are any topics you want covered or any questions you'd like answered, please email us at podcast.offthelot@gmail.com.
You can also find us on Instagram and YouTube. Our handles are in the show notes. Be sure to like, follow, and subscribe. And share this with your friends. See you next week.